are listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network.
Welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that's always up to speed with the latest Formula One news. Follow us on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Now, here are your hosts, Mark Daly and Kevin Laramang.
Just what I ever do without you, whether I lose or if I win. I know one thing that never changes. What I ever do without you, whether I lose or if I win.
Hello and welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One racing. I'm your host, Mark Daly, and this is episode number 21. As always, thanks so much for downloading the show and checking out what we have going on here. Also, thank you so much for all your shares on Facebook, your tweets, or wherever you've been sharing the show on your favorite social media platform. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much to all of you who've been leaving us nice reviews on iTunes. The show is finally starting to gain a little bit of traction. Sorry, no pun intended. And it's slowly starting to percolate into the consciousness of other Formula One fans. So we really do appreciate everything that you've been doing to help spread the word. So we got a great show planned tonight to preview round number 20 of the 2016 season. 20, can you believe it? That means in a couple of weeks, the longest ever Formula One season is going to wrap up, and I can't believe how quickly it's actually gone. But that's enough for me for now, because to help break down the latest news and preview the Brazilian Grand Prix is Chris Stevens. Chris writes for FormulaSpy.com and co-hosts the Missed Apex podcast. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you very much.
Well, so before we get started, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do in relation to Formula One?
I write about Formula One for the FIA accredited website, FormulaSpy.com. It's been running for nearly 3 years now, that website. I joined this year doing Formula One reports and news, opinion pieces and stuff like that. I'm also on a Formula One podcast called Missed Apex podcast. So I've been doing that for roughly about the same amount of time, I think. I've been doing motorsports in general for about 5 years now. I started up a blog when I was 14 years old. And I look back on it, and it's a little bit rubbish, but it got my foot on the ladder, and I went through various publications covering different sorts of things between like Formula One, Formula E, and a few like other national series as well before I found myself where I am now.
Very cool. So where did it all start for you? Where did you first get bitten by the bug for Formula One?
Surprisingly, I was a late bloomer. Actually, the first race I ever watched, like properly sat down and watched, was the 2010 Chinese Grand Prix.
Okay,
and I didn't know a lot about it. I just knew that Jenson Button and Lewis Hamilton were the two British drivers, so I was sat there rooting them on, and they come home 1-2, and I got the bug from then. Really, the motorsports bug came from MotoGP. Because my dad would have me on the weekends, and he's a big motorcycle fan. He had a very nice Honda Fireblade at the time they would take me out on, and we would sit down and watch bike racing together, and it was fantastic.
It's funny how motorsports, once it really gets a hold of you, how it's tough to let it go. I remember my first time when I was really bitten by the bug. To use that phrase, I've already used it a couple times, but I was a young kid, and my dad is an Englishman, and he was always going to different races, not just Formula One, but when he was living in England. So we always kind of grew up with it around the house. But when I was little, I remember watching the 1985 European Grand Prix at Brands Hatch, and I was absolutely mesmerized and just completely, I just couldn't get enough of this one guy by the name of Nigel Mansell. And I remember this fantastic pit stop that they made. And Nigel went on to win that race. And from that moment, I was a big Mansell fan and a big Formula One fan. It's stuck with me ever since. So it's pretty cool. And yeah, I know it's just I kind of go through the different periods of my life, and kind of all sort of major points in my life all sort of seem to revolve around Formula One in one way or something that was happening on that track. I can almost remember what was happening in my life at the same time. So it's pretty cool. But here we are in 2016. We're at the penultimate Grand Prix this weekend at Interlagos in Brazil. And there are so many different talking points in Formula One at the moment, not just necessarily what's going on the track, but this past week or so, and in the last couple of weeks, in fact, there's been more movement in the paddock with different drivers and different teams confirming their lineups for 2017. Lance Stroll was confirmed at Williams to race alongside Valtteri Bottas. Esteban Gutierrez is leaving Haas. Kevin Magnussen has turned down a one-year deal to stay at Renault. And Esteban Ocon is switching from Manor to Force India in a move that Toto Wolff says that it proves that talent still wins over money in Formula One. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on some of the different moves that the different drivers that have moved about for 2017, and just hear your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, there's been a whole raft of movement after so much speculation about what's going to happen next year. And of course, it's a bit of a lottery because Formula One's going to be so different next year with the regulation changes. I'll start with Williams because that was the worst kept secret in Formula One. We've known about the Stroll deal for a very long time. Originally, was meant to be moving into his father's GP2 team, Prema. But this Williams deal came up, and why wouldn't you take it? Because GP2, although it's a feeder series, it's sort of stagnated in the past few years as a series that breeds future F1 champions. I mean, before Jolyon Palmer, I think Romain Grosjean was the last driver to win the GP2 championship and actually progress into Formula One the following year. So I think it's a good move for him to be coming straight into F1. I mean, it didn't do Max Verstappen any harm yet. There's still a bit of debate about him, but I think it's a great move for him, and I think Williams will be a really good place for him to start his career. I don't know about over on your side of the pond, but over here, for some reason, people will hear about his father's billionaire status and immediately assume he is a pay driver, which really saddens me because I think he's about as far from a pay driver as you can get. Yes, he's got this amazing financial backing from his father that any team would be thankful to have, but the boy has just dominated the Formula 3 championship, 14 wins out of 30 races. And that's no easy feat. It's a very, very competitive field. I mean, he ended the season with 3 wins on the bounce in Hockenheim. You know, this boy is very talented. He's only just turned 18. He's got such a long career ahead of him. And I think his sort of status inside the little tight-neck motorsporting community is going to be the kick up the backside that Valtteri Bottas needs. Because I feel like he's been sort of wallowing lately. You know, I mean, he had 2014, which was a really great year, and then after that the car started to underperform, and I think he maybe started to underperform relatively as well. So I think to have Massa gone and a new fresh-faced young kid teammate, that'll be just the spark he needs.
Yeah, I definitely agree, because Williams, they've lost their way a little bit. They seem to be trending upwards over the last couple of years, and this year they've been one of the teams besides Ferrari that have really kind of disappointed me. I really expected to see more things from them, and as we saw with Max Verstappen when he signed for Toro Rosso in 2015, and obviously the progression for him from the junior team into Red Bull itself was fairly short. So perhaps Lance is that guy that maybe will provide a bit of a spark to Williams. And I totally understand what you're saying, though, about the criticism or maybe the perception that he's a pay driver. But if he was purely just a pay driver, then you would expect maybe he might be driving for a Sauber or maybe a Manor F1 or something like that. I think for a team like Williams, and I mean, obviously these guys bring a lot of sponsorship money with them anyways, regardless who they drive for. But I think regardless, if the Williams hasn't lived up to maybe the expectations with the car over maybe the last year or so, it's still a very well-established and one of the more successful teams in Formula One. And just in my mind, I don't think that's the kind of team that you can just walk into Sir Frank Williams' office with a big pile of cash and you're going to get a race seat. I still think, obviously, that if you're going to drive for a team like Williams, sure, it doesn't hurt to have that sponsorship money, but you have to be a good driver as well. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
No, I definitely agree. I mean, as far as Williams are concerned, they almost need that money, though, because you look at where they are in the championship and who's ahead of them. It's Ferrari, Red Bull, Mercedes. The budgets of those teams are astronomical in comparison to what an independent team like Williams would be having. The fact that they're falling behind Force India now is a worry for them, I would say. Frankly, I think they were a bit lucky to finish where they did in the championship last year, because you look at, Force India, they didn't have a proper car until halfway through the season. Red Bull were too busy bickering with Renault for the second half of the year about their engines, and they booted them out, and then very kindly had to say, "Hey, can we have your engines again?"
Yeah, that was a little bit awkward, wasn't it?
Oh God, yeah, that was awful for them. But no, I think it will be just what Williams are looking for.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting, too, that, like you were saying, that, of course, when you have teams like Mercedes, Ferrari, and Red Bull that have these huge budgets, that, of course, they're going to be the ones that are basically setting the standard. They're the ones that basically everybody's trying to catch up to. But I'm a little bit more concerned when you look at Williams and you see that they're, I wouldn't say struggling to keep up with Force India, but they're definitely locked in a pretty tight battle with those two cars. And the thing that really kind of makes me a little bit concerned to a certain degree, if you're Williams, is that I heard earlier in the year that Force India had basically stopped all development and any development of the car for this year, and was basically focusing the majority of their resources to the development and the design of the new car for 2017. So when you sort of maybe take it in that context and they're still falling behind them a little bit, then yeah, I can see why you'd be a little bit concerned if you're in the Williams garage. But just let's talk a little bit now about Renault. They've confirmed their driver lineup this week, that Julian Palmer will be driving beside Nico Hülkenberg. Magnussen did want to take a one-year deal with them, so I thought that was a little bit interesting. And they've also announced that they're working on a brand new engine for 2017. So obviously this is going to be a multi-year project. You're not going to go from where they were this year or maybe where they were last year as the cash-strapped and obviously struggling Lotus team. But what do you make of the moves and what Renault's doing right now? Do you think that they're heading in the right direction 1 year into this new program?
Definitely. I mean, when Renault came back into Formula One this year, we always knew there was going to be a sort of 3, 4, 5 year plan for them to be competitive enough to fight for race victories on a regular basis. And the partnership of Magnussen and Palmer made a lot of sense to me. It was very young, very dynamic, and it looked towards the future. There were two drivers who could get very comfortable in their team, so that when you were at the head of the field, you would have two drivers that were a complete serenity with themselves and with the team. And that's why it was so confusing to me to hear all these rumors about Magnussen going or Palmer going to another team, or even being forced out of the team. We know that this Renault seat is going to be hot property in a couple of years' time, so that's why it makes sense to get in now. And so when Perez was linked to that seat a month or so ago, and he didn't take it, and I still think that that's a bit naive of him, because he's not going to win a race in a Force India, is he? He might do in a Renault in a couple of years' time. So Hülkenberg has gone and bagged himself that, and then you've got yourself stuck between Magnussen and Palmer, with Esteban Ocon rumored to be in that seat as well, which I believe was the original plan for because he was their third driver when they made the announcement back in February, if I remember correctly. Of course, him being a Mercedes young driver as well was always going to make things awkward. And the fact that he's in the manor now for this season and the Force India next year, that's kind of tied him into that. So Magnussen's decision to not take a 1 year deal as well, very smart from him, because when you're in a long-term project, taking a 1-year deal makes no sense. That to me says, Kevin, we want you to do all the legwork, and then we're going to get a much faster driver in when we're actually competitive enough to win races. Because no offense, but we don't see you doing this. So it was smart to get out.
Yeah, definitely. That's a very good way of putting it. But just talking about Jolyon Palmer, how do you see, or what is your evaluation of how he's done so far in his first year in Formula One, and obviously in a bit of a interesting situation in basically what's a brand new Formula One team?
Yeah, Palmer's really impressed me. I know he gets a lot of stick for being slow and oh so near the points at times, but in his first race in Australia, having not actually raced a car for a year, had been sat on the sidelines, he actually really, really impressed me with his racecraft against the two Toro Rossos, against Bottas in that first race. He did some really good side-by-side. He's had a lot of bad luck since then. And you got to remember, he is effectively driving last year's Lotus with a Renault engine in it. That's effectively what this car is, because Renault had no time to design their own car when they bought the Lotus team. So credit where it's due. And yeah, maybe it took him a little bit longer than it should have done to score a point, but you got to remember the car he's in as well. And also he's progressed fantastically from, where he was in Australia to where he is now. I actually think in these last sort of 3-4 races, he's outperformed Kevin. I still can't help but feel if Kevin hadn't turned down the 1-year deal, Renault would have preferred him to stay than Jolyon. But I certainly don't think they've got a bad deal on keeping Palmer on for another year. And another year in the sport can do wonders to a man. I think he'll really come into his own next year.
Well, definitely. He'll have a year experience under his belt, and it's basically going to be a almost the identical race calendar, I believe, as it is to this year. I think it's 21 races, if I'm not mistaken. So he'll have that benefit of seeing most of the circuits before. So, yeah, that experience will definitely be hopefully reap him some benefits in 2017. So before we move on to the Brazilian Grand Prix now, let's just dial it back a little bit, because there's still some fallout from the Mexican Grand Prix, if you can believe it. It's been almost 2 weeks, but Ferrari, and this perhaps is no surprise, but they have reviewed the incident between Sebastian Vettel and the two Red Bulls of Danny Ricciardo and Max Verstappen, which ended up getting a 5-second penalty for Max Verstappen for leaving the track and then gaining an unfair advantage. And then Sebastian Vettel was then penalized 10 seconds after the race and was then dropped to P5. And I still think that was the weirdest podium ceremony I think I've ever seen, considering two of the guys that were there or thereabouts didn't actually end up on the third step of the podium by the time it was all said and done. And the one guy that should have been there didn't actually get to go out and celebrate. But anyways, Ferrari have said that they have reviewed the incident and found that a number of new elements have come to light, and that's in quotes, but they haven't made it public, but they want to have this incident reviewed. And perhaps if it is, that it'll be reviewed by the stewards before the Brazilian Grand Prix. Have you heard anything else? And what do you make of this decision by Ferrari?
Well, they're well within their rights to do so. I mean, to have something reopened from a previous race, new evidence has to be presented. Ferrari have that. They're not saying what it is. And I can't imagine what it could be. If it's a piece of telemetry, why was it not shown in Mexico? So it confuses me a little bit what this new evidence is.
Yeah, I kind of wonder, and I'm just sort of thinking as we were talking here, that perhaps maybe they've got some sort of telemetry, like you say, that maybe shows that he'd moved before the telemetry actually shows him braking, so therefore he's not moving on Danny Ricciardo under braking, if it's something like that. But they definitely think that they have something up their sleeve, and it will be interesting whether they decide that they'll be able to have that heard and reviewed by the stewards, and whether something will come of it. But it's just been a very long and frustrating year for Ferrari, and I think it's just an indication of the larger picture there.
Well, I mean, the ones you got to feel for the most are the fans in this scenario, because here they are. They've watched the race. They've already seen the podium changed once before the podium actually happens, and they go away and go to bed, and then they wake up and find, oh, actually, neither of those guys finished on the podium. It was the other guy who actually finished fifth. So I can understand the fans' frustration in all of this, and for us to go back 2 weeks later and say, actually, we think the other guy should be on the podium now is all a bit, it's too much, and I believe that this is the sort of thing that Bernie Ecclestone really wants to clamp down on. So maybe it's a general rule of 3 or 4 hours after the checkered flag, that's the result. We can't change it after that.
Yeah, it would make sense because I agree with you. It makes no sense and it doesn't really do anything for anybody at this point. I could see perhaps if Vettel had been he'd won the race and then that 10-second penalty had moved him off of the podium, and you could see there. But I mean, realistically, from what we've seen this year, if you're not driving a Mercedes or a Red Bull, then unless something else happens, then it's going to take a bit of a miracle to actually win a Grand Prix, unless you have something like at Monaco where there's like a lot of bad weather and there's a lot of attrition, and then some of these weird things happen. And I'm thinking specifically of, what was it, 1997 when Olivier Panis won in the Ligier. That's one of those very Monaco moments.
Oh.
But yeah, I think that Ferrari, unless something very odd happens to either Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg or Max Verstappen or Danny Ricciardo in these last two races, I can't really see anyone other than those four drivers winning a race, unless Ferrari magically finds something that has or hasn't been there for the entire year.
No, it really is a bit of a dire scenario when you go back to the beginning of the year, and we all expected this big do or die battle for the championship between Lewis Hamilton and Sebastian Vettel. It was the year that finally Ferrari are going to be taking the challenge to Mercedes at last, and that lasted for one race, and we've seen nothing of it since.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember reading all the information and all the articles that were coming out before the season saying that Ferrari was within a tenth of a second of Mercedes. And like you say, this was going to be the year that they were going to push the silver arrows. And then we saw a little bit of that in Australia. And ever since then, they've been slowly regressing. Of course, Sebastian Vettel has had a bit of bad luck and has been acquainted with Danny Kvyat in many different ways, in many different incidents on the track over the year. But I think at this point in the year, this could very well be, well, it depends how much of a betting man you are, I suppose. But I guess you could almost say you could put some money down that it's going to be pretty tough for them to win a race in 2017. But let's now just take a look now at the Brazilian Grand Prix. It's already Friday, so the practice sessions have already started. Now, this is going to be an interesting race for a couple of things. The local interest story, if you're a Brazilian race fan, is that this will be Felipe Massa's final home Grand Prix before he retires at the end of the season. He said that he's aiming for a podium, but I don't know if he has the car underneath him that is actually going to give him a chance to actually challenge for a podium.
No, it's quite a bold statement from him, because I think Williams have had one podium this year, if I remember rightly, maybe two. It's wishful thinking, that's for sure, because you're right, they simply don't have the car for it. Although, that said, today they did look quicker than Ferrari, maybe the third quickest car. And of course, that final sector, which is 14 seconds flat out all the way out of Zhongshao up the hill, that blind hill, actually, which I only recently found out, and down the pit straight. That's going to be a real strong point for Williams. They'll probably struggle around the rest of the lap, but if they find themselves in a good place at the start, it's going to be tough for other cars to pass them.
Oh, definitely. If they've obviously got the straight line speed, the Williams. It's just they just don't have it going through the tighter, more technical parts of the racetrack. So, yeah, if he can qualify well and he can get a good strategy and the tires last on him, who knows? But based on what we've seen, it might be a little bit of a stretch. But Felipe is one of those guys. I think that I think he's fairly popular among the fans, and I don't think that anyone would begrudge seeing Massa get onto the podium on Sunday. Okay, well, let's talk about the Drivers' Championship now. Nico Rosberg is still leading Lewis Hamilton by 19 points with the 2 last races of the year. He hasn't won since the Japanese Grand Prix, and Lewis is slowly eaten into his lead, winning at the U.S. Grand Prix in Austin, Texas, and then at the Mexican Grand Prix this last week. Nico's been a little bit conservative, but I guess he hasn't really been pushing the car, taking too many risks. So what do you think going into Brazil? If he wins the race, then it's completely over? Or do you think that he just maintains and keeps going the way that he has done the last 2 races and just tries to keep his nose clean, no pun intended, and just tries not to push the machinery too hard?
Yeah, it's an interesting one from Nico because he always has this mental attitude of just take each race as it comes, going for victory, every single time and not to really think about the championship. And it's a nice approach really, because when you've got the quickest car, you're only really in direct competition with one person. If this was 2012, I'd say that's completely the wrong mental attitude and you have to be thinking about the championship all the time. But, we're dealing with a championship that's between 2 people within the same team. So up until, this point, it's served him very well this year. But yeah, I'd have to say that, with especially after Japan, when he got into that position where, he could just follow Lewis home for the remainder of the season and still be champion. And so I can't help but think that since then he has, sort of taken a step back and thinking, I don't need to take any unnecessary risks. If he is still going by that same mental attitude of just go every race by race, then I would start to be a little bit worried because, he's lost to Lewis in the last 2 races. Mexico, though, was a weird one because everyone was really struggling around there. The track was just not yielding any grip in any amount of temperature in any session. It was very, very bizarre.
It was, and I thought what was interesting for myself was that there was that big difference between Nico and Lewis, and you could clearly tell that he was a couple of tenths off the pace that Lewis had. And then out of nowhere, in his final qualifying lap in Q3, he pulls this really quick lap out of the bag, out of nothing, really out of the ether, to get that second spot on the starting grid. And I was really quite impressed by that. But the one thing... Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was saying, I think it serves as evidence to the theory that Mercedes have been turning down the power on his engines to conserve them to the end of the season, until that last lap in Q3 when they really need it. Because we've seen Mercedes play around with engine modes. We know that, as soon as they hit Q2, they turn the power up on that thing and it goes a second and a bit quicker on some tracks. It's phenomenal, like peak power of over 1,000 horsepower now. And it's just phenomenal what they're playing with. But of course, Lewis stocked up on engines in Belgium, so he's good until the end of the season. Nico didn't have to do that. So really, when you think about it, those failures that Lewis was having at the beginning of the season is playing into his hands now. Maybe a blessing in disguise sort of thing, because Nico is having to run conservatively until he has to. So I think that final run in Q3 we saw in Mexico was, his actual pace and not the other laps we saw.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I also think, just going back to Mexico, what I thought was interesting as well was that when the race had kind of settled down and they'd had their first pit stops and things like that, and then Verstappen had switched on to the medium tires and he was really pulling them in. You could tell that he was really pushing hard to come back and challenge Nico and maybe try and get that second position from him. But I thought it was quite interesting that Nico's lap time stayed fairly consistent, and then he let Verstappen close the gap, and then he just tried to manage that gap once Verstappen was close and kind of keep it maybe at a second and a half, just 2 seconds, just keep him that that distance, just maybe keep him outside of DRS range. And then, of course, at the end there, they go into that first corner and Carlos Sainz gets a little bit in the way and Nico trips over him. And then, of course, Max has that one big lunge and tried to make a passing maneuver on Nico that just didn't stick. And I think that maybe ruined his tires to a little bit of a degree there. But I think that maybe Nico is going to just do that, just not push the equipment and risk an accident or maybe risk a mechanical failure, because he still doesn't need to win any of the races. He can still come home in second or third and still become champion by the time that they finish at Abu Dhabi in a couple of weeks. But I still have to wonder if the opportunity presents itself, whether Nico will go for the jugular, if you will, and really try to win that race if the opportunity presents itself.
Yeah, I mean, his tactics in Mexico were interesting, well thought out, because it's already tough to overtake in Formula One. It is, and the aerodynamics of the cars these days make it even harder to pass, because as soon as you get close to someone, that's it, you just lose a whole bunch of grip and you can't maintain that pace anymore. In Mexico, it's even tougher, because the layout of the track doesn't really lend itself to close racing. I know it's got a massive front straight where the drivers are reaching record-breaking speeds, but you're coming out of a stadium section, low-speed corner, driver will gain half a second on the car behind by the time they've even reached the start-finish line. And, of course, at such high altitude as well, the air is very thin, and that makes the slipstream effects much smaller as well. So it is tough to pass in Mexico, and for Nico to be able to manage that gap, it's a smart tactic from him, and one that would most definitely work in those conditions. The issue Nico has right now is that the plan is working now, but what if, say, like in 2014, for example, when his ERS systems failed at the final race, what if that were to happen again this year in Abu Dhabi, and he doesn't score any points, and Lewis is the one who ends up taking the spoils? And that's why I like his race by race attitude of going for victory every time, because you need to take that when it comes. You need to be able to score every little point for the stuff that happens that is out of your control. Stuff like mechanical failures.
Yeah, and exactly. And especially in a season that is as long as it is this year, 21 races, the longest season in history, that everybody's going to deal with something at some point. And but just another issue that I've been looking at, and I wonder if Nico has learned from this over the last couple of races, is just his conservative approach at the start, and maybe being a little bit, I don't want to say lackadaisical, but maybe leaving the door open a little bit too much going into the first corner. We saw that at Austin, that he went he left the door open quite a bit, and Danny Ricciardo barged his way through, and he did the same thing. And I know that Verstappen barged his way past Rosberg and pushed him off of the track, but at the same time, when Max is getting all this criticism from Toto Wolff and Niki Lauda and Nico Rosberg to a certain extent, I think that Rosberg did invite that, because he didn't really learn from the US Grand Prix. And you leave half a car width or a car width, and especially to a guy like Max Verstappen, I think he's going to have a go. So I think what's going to be very interesting, depending on how the qualifying turns out tomorrow, where Nico ends up on the track, and if he does find himself behind somebody else, he's not on pole position, what does he do in the first corner? Obviously, he's not going to risk a collision with another car, but at the same time, has he learned from that he's maybe going to have to take a bit of a tighter line to maybe just prevent one of his rivals trying to get their nose past, because they know that he's got a lot on the line and he's not going to risk anything.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I'd say before Nico retook the championship lead, I'd say that the vast majority of his intense wheel-to-wheel action that he's come out negatively on, especially with Lewis, there was fairly even Stevens between them in 2014, but there were those few races towards the back end of 2015, Austin being a prime example, Japan, where Lewis would just shove him off the racetrack, basically, with every right to do so. Lewis would find a way to come out on top, and Nico tried to do the same thing to Lewis in Austria this year, and it completely backfired in his face terribly. He lost out on a potential win, an easy second place, and ended up not finishing on the podium. So I feel like his confidence took a knock from that, because you look at the events after that, what happened in Germany, for example, when he was penalized for pushing Max off the track. All of a sudden he's got previous in this, and so people are keeping an eye on him. And I feel like he tries to maybe avoid it as much as possible, because he's almost like a Jorge Lorenzo in a sense. Get up the front of the field and just control the pace with metronomic consistency from then on. And that's the best way to win a race.
I think so. And I totally agree what you say, that especially when it comes down to a one-on-one battle between Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton, my money is going to be on Lewis 100% of the time until Nico Rosberg can prove me wrong otherwise. And what you were saying, that incident in the final, I think was the penultimate lap at the Austrian Grand Prix this year, I think that's just a case in point. I think that when the two of them are locked in the battle with each other, I think that Lewis just has that extra bit of, well, he's obviously the quicker of the two drivers in identical equipment, the identical car. He is the quicker of the driver, but I think also mentally he's got an edge on Nico Rosberg as well. So it'll be interesting to see if Nico can ever come out on top with on a battle like that with Lewis. And I don't think he can at this point in time.
Well, don't get me wrong. I think Nico would be a very, very worthy champion this year.
Agreed. Yeah.
Because he's really stepped up his game. Massively in terms of his pace, his approach to racing as well. He's really, really improved. And I think that Lewis, when he's won races this year, he's been unstoppable, unbeatable, fantastic. But he's had those very, very odd weekends a bit too often where he just has no answer to Nico, and he's lost and struggling and almost lashes out sometimes. He gets quite frustrated and is lost within himself. And he's been doing that a bit too often this year. And so for me, if he won the championship this year, I don't think it would have been as good as his championship in 2014 or 2015, for example.
Yeah, and it's funny you should mention that too, because I was just thinking too that when you're just mentioning that Lewis hasn't really been as consistent as, or maybe as motivated as he has been in the past, I kind of think that since the Japanese Grand Prix, I think we've seen more of the Lewis Hamilton that we expect. I mean, not only is he quick in the car, but he just seems mentally a little bit more tuned in. I think obviously that engine that blew up on him in Malaysia must have been just completely devastating. And I was wondering how he was going to come back from that and how he would approach that mentally. And of course, Japan was a little bit challenging for him, but all credit to Lewis that in the last couple of races, he's really buckled down. And so I think regardless if you're Lewis Hamilton or you're not, he's had a lot of things to deal with this year. Obviously, there were some questions coming into the year after having won a third world championship last year. Is he motivated enough? Is his personal life a little bit too distracting? All these different things that kind of come with Lewis Hamilton. But at the end of the day, he still is Lewis Hamilton. And at every Grand Prix, if Lewis is there and he's in a competitive car, he has to be considered one of the favorites to win. So this leads me into my final question before we wrap it up. And I hope that you've polished your crystal ball. And Lewis has never won at Interlagos in 9 previous visits. Do you think that this is the weekend that maybe he can get it done?
I think so. I think so. There's a bit of rain forecast in the way as well, and I think after the performances we saw from them in Monaco, that will favour Lewis. And the pace in the dry in practice today as well was consistently quicker than Nico as well. So I'd say, I think he can just about keep this championship alive until Abu Dhabi.
Very cool. Yeah, I find it hard to bet against Lewis, considering the form that he's been on in the last 3 weeks to a month. So I would think that, especially if there's rain, that Lewis is going to be the favorite to win, and it'll be interesting. It's going to be exciting, and should it come down to the wire in Abu Dhabi in a couple of weeks' time, we could be in for quite a finale. All right, Chris. Well, that's about all the time we have tonight. So before you go, could you let everybody know where they can find you online, please?
Yeah, find all my written work at formulaspy.com and follow me on Twitter at cstevens_journo.
Perfect. Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, F1 fans, there we go. That's another show in the bag, and that wraps up another week. A big round of applause for Chris Stevens from formulaspy.com for joining me tonight to help preview and break down this weekend's Brazilian Grand Prix. Make sure you go and check out all of Chris's work, and be sure to give him a follow on Twitter. Kevin and I will be back at the start of next week to review the race, and maybe, just maybe, we'll be talking about the crowning of a new Formula One champion. Until then, give us a follow on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod, and shoot us an email at scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com if you want to get in touch. Of course, we really appreciate it if you head on over to the iTunes store and leave us a nice review as well. And that's it. That's all I got. Until next time, I'm out of here.
Thanks for listening to the Scuderia F1 podcast. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, then head over to scuderiaf1pod.com. Want to get in touch with us? Then email us at scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com.
You were listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network. Visit us, sportspodcastingnetwork.com.